Good afternoon and welcome to our Zoom conference. We still have Sammy Wilson to join us, so our first speaker will be Barney Reynolds. I'll just say a few words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now reached a critical stage in determining our future trading relationships, not only with the European Union, but also the rest of the world. Regrettably, the government's ability to communicate its objectives has been abysmal, culminating in the misconceived statement by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland last week. This has enabled the Remain establishment to once again regain its voice with the support of a hostile media. Doubtless the government will plead coronavirus in its defence, but our future global trading opportunities will be much more important to the British people in the decades to come, long after coronavirus has been forgotten. It's essential that the green benches of the House of Commons once again become the cockpit of our national political life. In the 19th century, Lord Palmerston said there were only 3 people who understood the Selwyn-Holstein question. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have 3 speakers who have a deep understanding of the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol and the implications which flow from them. Our first speaker is Barney Reynolds. Barney is global head of the financial services industry group at the multinational law firm of Sherman and Sterling. To hold a position such as that means that Barney commands immense expertise, which he brings to our discussion today. Many of you may not have been aware of Barney's contribution to our cause, but I can assure you that his legal expertise has been invaluable. In July, he co-authored the Censor for Brexit policy document entitled Replacing the Withdrawal Agreement: How to Ensure that the UK Takes Back Control on Exiting the Transition. This is an extraordinarily important piece of analysis. It concludes that the EU has been acting in breach of the withdrawal agreement by denying the UK an FTA, that the EU has attempted to impose unreasonable restrictions on the UK which no other country would accept, and that the withdrawal agreement breaks the terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
After 4, okay.
Barney and his co-authors then set out a 3-stage plan to replace the withdrawal agreement with an acceptable agreement. In recent days, Barney has also reiterated that it is the EU, not the UK, that has broken international law. Barney, welcome here today, and thank you for taking time out from your demanding schedule to contribute to our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Barney Reynolds.
Thanks, Barry. That's a very kind introduction. I'll try and live up to it. Just to start then with why we're where we are. In leaving the EU, there were 2 major popular votes. First on the referendum itself, and secondly to elect the Boris Johnson's government. But I think in the course of that election, it was determined that the preference of the country, if possible, would not be a hard Brexit, as it's been termed, but to try and leave with a win-win future relationship deal that provides for favourable trading relationship going forward. And And for that reason, and in my view only for that reason, the UK signed up to the withdrawal agreements and Northern Ireland Protocol, which were basically a transition step to the relationship I'm talking about. The EU wanted to divide into two the process of leaving, dealing with the three issue systems, Northern Ireland and money, in the first stage, but then bringing them together again at the end of this year in the second stage. There is an option for the UK to have extended that period. The UK decided not to. I think that was a perfectly sensible decision and a correct decision. And so at the end of this year, the agreement was that we would end up with a future relationship that encompasses all of the transitional issues, but also a number of final issues. And in that agreement, in Article 184 of the withdrawal agreement, the EU agreed to use best endeavours and good faith, which are very significant obligations in international law. They don't just mean showing up to a negotiating room and sort of reiterating a line. It means actually engaging properly to get to, at year end, a relationship on the terms of the political declaration. And the most fundamental provision in that political declaration is Article 4, which makes clear that any such arrangement must respect UK sovereignty, which of course is indivisible, and also the UK's internal market. There are other mentions of the UK's internal market and so on in the political declaration. That declaration does also talk about a level playing field. I'll come to that in order to sort of ensure that there's true and fair competition. But that doesn't necessitate the use of EU law to achieve it. And in fact, achieving it by use of EU law would be in breach of the concept of respecting UK sovereignty. Similarly, the idea that the UK doesn't have proper ownership of its fishing waters. Now, when countries leave larger units as a legal matter throughout history, with a breakup of the of various empires, including the UK, as empire and breakup of the USSR, basically as a matter of state practice, existing trading relationships carry on in the current form until a new one is put into place. And that has been recognised right from the very beginning of the predecessor of the WTO being set up, GATT, in 1947, where someone went painstakingly through all the instances of decolonialisation, carved them out of GATT. Now, the reason is, otherwise, the exiting state operates under WTO law, and one of the key provisions of that is the most favoured nation provision, which means that the larger unit they're leaving would then say, well, I can only give you as good a set of terms as anyone else I'm giving under this MFN provision. Now, as I say, historically, those provisions have been waived in order to allow for units to break off from bigger units and respect the self-determination of peoples. The EU are not taking that view, I think uniquely actually in this particular context, which has caused an awful lot of political difficulties. The result of which is we're in a situation where the UK government is endeavouring to see if we can reach a relationship in accordance with the political declaration at year end, in order that you achieve as part of that a free trade agreement which covers the whole, or substantially the whole of the UK economy and also the whole of the UK, because it's only a free trade agreement that gives you an out from the MFN rules under WTO. There is one other out, which is a security-based exemption, which you use for Northern Ireland. The EU are not keen to do that, because it would then beg the question of why they aren't doing the same in in respect to their other 44 borders, some of which involve security situations like Russia and Turkey. So in the latest situation, obviously, involves looking at some of the encroachments on UK sovereignty in the interim arrangements of the withdrawal agreement of Northern Ireland Protocol, all of which need replacing at year end. And the government, very sensibly in relation to Northern Ireland, is seeking to ensure that the agreements are not left to be unadulterated and unamended at year end if there isn't a replacement deal in the full package of arrangements that are being negotiated. The reason being that otherwise the EU would be allowed to cherry pick from those arrangements, taking the bits that they happen to like from the withdrawal agreements and Northern Ireland Protocol, are not delivering on the one key thing that matters to the UK, which is the future relationship on the grounds of the political declaration. And if that political declaration future relationship, which is far more favourable than what's rumoured to be currently under discussion, doesn't transpire, then the UK will not have received sort of its part of the bargain, and so the whole lot should fall away. Sovereignty, of course, is key to all of this and is key to Brexit, and it's intrinsic to the nature of Brexit and intrinsic to the powers exercised to deliver Brexit, which is Article 50, the withdrawal process of the EU treaty, which does not provide for a long-term future relationship. It provides for wrapping up of points if the two parties wish to do so, with bearing in mind the framework for the future relationship, which is the political declaration. Unless that's delivered on, then there was a complete misconception at the outset as to what everyone was signing up to. So what does the UK seek? It seeks a win-win trade deal, principally, in goods, agri-products, financial services and other services. That can easily be achieved. We have the text and proposals for that. Basically, for goods and agri-products, we're asking for the same, no less than Canada and Japan. And actually, that's a pretty watered-down ask. We, in fact, given our relationship, should really expect something much bigger than that, but the EU are currently not discussing it. And services, it should be mutual recognition of qualifications and the like. Financial services, it involves enhanced equivalence, for which I've drafted the treaty text based on existing EU law concepts of equivalence, easily executable and not a major lift as a matter of abstract theory. And that should be achievable as part of the package as well by year end. I think an awful lot of this has been agreed. We're talking about points that currently the EU are pushing for, which encroach on UK sovereignty, and they're not yet talking about financial services and other services. We would, as an aside, like a similar sort of arrangement with the US and others, and there's no reason to think that we couldn't get elements or all of or most of this with other countries around the world, or other trading blocks and units around the world. Why is that? Why is it possible to think that this is all achievable? One key reason which needs to be understood, I think, is that the EU at the moment is half complete in law. And it trades as the EU. So for WTO law purposes, it trades as the EU bloc. For currency purposes, it trades as the Eurozone. And for fiscal purposes, it relies on member states. Those latter two propositions are incompatible. You can't have sovereign member states at the same time as a sovereign currency. You've got to have one or the other. Now, the result of this half-built system is that the EU in law is engaged in three things to the detriment of the UK and US, in fact, and others around the world, which need to be dealt with in any trading relationship, and in fact drive to the arrangement that I've described. The first is that the currency is structurally undervalued, because the currency value is pulled down by the massive debt piles in the Saudi international, and
or metaphorically out of thin air. That's where
You're
the
not one
money
of the
comes.
speakers. Could you please mute your microphone?
Well, this is all fantastic, and we've got 9.5 million people on furlough.
So the first thing is the dumping of produce from the Eurozone onto the UK and the rest of the world, which arises from a structurally depressed currency value. And that arises from the fact that you've got member state financing and fiscal arrangements, rather than the federal Eurozone system, which is required for a proper currency zone. And that is in breach of WTO law and allows the UK and US, if it wishes, to levy self-help remedies involving imposition of tariffs to put those products back in the position and at the price level that they should be at, were that not to have arisen. Secondly, there's unfair subsidization going on through the Target 2 system, which involves basically unlimited vendor financing through financing for purchasers in the Eurozone system. Again, in breach of WTO subsidization rules, and again actionable through the self-help remedies regime, this time through duties. And in addition to that, artificially cheap banking and lending through the fact that the Eurozone system is not properly capitalized. That last point arises from the fact that in law, the Eurozone system and the EU law as a whole treats the member state debt, which finances the Eurozone, as being a sovereign quality and as akin to cash. And you need an instrument like that in order to run a currency zone or any sort of regulatory unit, because financial institutions and the Eurosystem itself, the EU, the EIB and so on, rely on riskless instruments, effectively cash, as the underpinning to a safe system, a safe and sound system. Now, unfortunately, there is no such instrument in the Eurozone, except in a very limited way to be created soon for tiny amounts in relative terms in relation to the grants being levied for and paid for COVID. As a result of which, the EU legal system is creating an unmanaged pool of financial risk in the trillions, which is through the Eurozone system, which is not being managed or mitigated. Now, the one exception to that is the UK is in fact mitigating this risk, where the EU meets the global financial market in London at the moment, and we do it by levying top-up capital requirements on all financial institutions here to cater for Eurozone risk. In terms of the way forward, these three things explain, first of all, why the Northern Ireland Protocol can't be allowed to stand, because we would not be able to protect businesses and citizens in Northern Ireland from the dumping and subsidisation and unfair effects that I've been discussing, because the EU law system itself ignores those effects and actually doubles down on them. Secondly, it explains why there needs to be a goods and agriculture deal for the UK. In that deal, we wouldn't throw away the protections under WTO law for dumping and subsidisation, but we could more methodically take evidence from the EU as to the level of distortion and apply those tariffs and duties in a more methodical way. In addition, in fact, the removal properly of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the need for an invisible border forces the EU effectively to confront the need for a whole of UK free trade agreement, because it's only then that you get out of the most favoured nation provision that I mentioned at the outset. And then finally, this analysis also explains why the EU needs to agree to an enhanced equivalence financial services deal, and that pulls along legal and other services and data at the same time, because it's only then that the UK can continue mitigating Eurozone risk while the Eurozone decides over the next 20, 30, 40 years whether and how to integrate politically and fiscally. And until that moment in time, it's a source of extraordinary amounts of unmanaged risk, which can't just be left there, that doesn't disappear by being ignored. It dissipates into the rest of the world through the global financial markets. And were the EU not to do this, the UK, and in fact the US as the other host of the global market, would need to mitigate the risk from outside the EU system with no arrangement in place, which would involve any financial institution having to take effectively the most cautious view of the risk embedded in EU financial institutions, because we know the rules are wrong and we know that the supervisors don't counteract that risk. And so that would then mean that it's prohibitively expensive to do business with EU financial institutions, the result of which would be either EU customers and businesses reach outside of EU law and regulation as they're entitled to do, and continue buying their financial services from the city in the cheapest possible way, but the EU doesn't currently wish them to do that. Or if the EU prevents them from doing that, the costs of funds within the Euro system would shoot up, and that would be very damaging to Eurozone growth. So common sense would tell us that there's only one way to do this deal, and we just need to go through the analysis and explain that, and so that people understand it. And then everyone ends up with what is actually a win-win situation, a win-win solution that in fact the UK was asking for from the very outset. And the EU insisted on the bifurcated process of having the first 3 points dealt with and then wrapping it up into the end of year thing. And it explains and pushes things towards the end of year result being win-win in the way that the UK has always wanted. Thanks, Barney.
Thank you very much indeed, Barney, for that comprehensive analysis. It's now my great pleasure to welcome the Right Honourable David Jones MP. David's been Member of Parliament for Clwyd West since 2005, and before that he served as a member of the Welsh Assembly. David also served in Prime Minister David Cameron's cabinet, and under the premiership of Theresa May, was the Minister of State at the Department for Exiting the European Union, which must rank as one of the most frustrating appointments in parliamentary history. Today, David is the Deputy Chairman of the European Research Group, the ERG. At the last general election, he decided not to stand down from Parliament because he wanted to come back to help deliver Brexit. Thank goodness for that. Ladies and gentlemen, over to David Jones.
Well, thank you so much, Barry, and thank you everyone for attending here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. And you're quite right, Barry. We are now at a critical moment in the Brexit process. But many of you might actually remark, well, so what else is new? We've been at critical moments in the Brexit process for the last 4.5 years, and I doubt very much whether much will change until such time as we've finally exited the transition period and we've recovered our sovereignty, which is, after all, what Brexit is all about. It's fair to say that the negotiations between the European Union and the United Kingdom have not proceeded as well as they might have done. But I do believe that Boris Johnson has catalyzed the process by announcing, as he did recently, that so far as the United Kingdom is concerned, the terms of the future relationship must be agreed by the 15th of October. And if not, then we will leave the European Union and trade with it on World Trade Organization terms. When we entered the withdrawal agreement earlier this year, we did so on the basis, as Barney has rightly pointed out, that both parties would do their very best to conclude a free trade agreement. In fact, the obligations on both parties were very clearly set out as negotiating in good faith, using best endeavors to achieve a free trade agreement. And there are obligations on the part of the European Union to respect United Kingdom's sovereignty and also to respect the internal integrity of the United Kingdom market. Sadly, however, it hasn't happened that way. And to be absolutely frank, the European Union in these negotiations has behaved very badly indeed. For a start, it's refused to talk about anything at all, apart from its so-called red lines of fisheries, of state aid, and of the so-called level playing field. And interestingly, unlike most negotiations, and I'm sure that many of you have been involved in negotiations, where the parties try to settle those elements of the heads of agreement that are in dispute, and then move on after doing so to the intractable ones, the EU has done exactly the opposite and has told the EU that it will not talk about anything else until those so-called red lines have been resolved. Quite clearly, these negotiations are not going to go anywhere for so long as the EU maintains that stance. And the problem appears to be, to use David Frost's terminology, that the European Union has not internalized the fact that the United Kingdom is no longer part of the European Union, is no longer a member state, and that the EU can't treat us as such. But the truth is that the EU is behaving towards the United Kingdom, the world's 5th largest economy, as if it were a minor province of a country such as Slovakia. So, given the manifest failure of the EU to observe its obligations under the withdrawal agreement, the British government has quite rightly given an ultimatum that we are frankly not prepared to hang about indefinitely. Either, to put it crudely, they talk to us sensibly, or we're off on the 15th of October. Now, that hasn't gone down terribly well in Brussels. And what has also gone down badly, as we know, is for the government to take steps through the vehicle of the UK Internal Market Bill, which is currently passing through the House of Commons. Which is currently passing through the House of Commons, to protect the integrity of the UK market from the threat posed by the withdrawal agreement, and most particularly the Northern Ireland Protocol. The acknowledgement by the Northern Ireland Secretary that certain closely focused and defined principles of international law might be breached as a consequence of triggering the powers in the bill has caused the most almighty consternation on the continent. The European Union, frankly, was sent into paroxysms of rage. And it got to the extent that Commissioner Šefčovič demanded that the British government should withdraw its bill by the end of this month. Now, frankly, having foreign powers demanding that British governments withdraw bills from the sovereign British Parliament is not something that, frankly, I would have thought is designed to go down terribly well in this country. But what is most interesting is that despite the fact that the EU makes great play of being mortally affronted by the contents of the UK Internal Market Bill, it has not withdrawn from the negotiations. The EU remains at the negotiating table with the UK. And that gives me reason to believe that the European Union does not want to leave these negotiations without a free trade agreement. Now, the question of whether or not the bill does breach international law is an interesting one, somewhat esoteric and probably of most interest to lawyers such as Barney. And of course, international law comes in all shapes and sizes. And there are certainly obligations under the withdrawal agreement and some of the actions proposed by the government in the UK Internal Market Bill would amount to a breach of them if the provisions of the bill were triggered. But it's important to remember that the terms of the bill are that none of it is actually triggered until such time as a statutory instrument authorizing that triggering has been made by a minister. Excuse me. But it has to be remembered that throughout these negotiations, there are obligations on both parties. The obligations move in both directions. And in this connection, I think it's pertinent to ask whether the European Union itself is in breach of its obligations under the withdrawal agreement. For a start, it's more than arguable that it has not negotiated with the United Kingdom in good faith. It certainly hasn't used best endeavors, because if it were using best endeavors, then it would not have refused to negotiate about anything other than its so-called red lines. Has it respected UK sovereignty? Well, I would say not. Not certainly if it's trying to re-establish the common fisheries policy, and not when we hear assertions from such as Michel Barnier, who asserts unbelievably that our waters may be British territorial waters, but the fish swimming in them are European fish. Now, it's true that we entered into the withdrawal agreement with our eyes open. And it's true that the withdrawal agreement has certain provisions that are really quite dangerous. But we also entered into the withdrawal agreement relying upon the obligations of the European Union to negotiate in good faith and to use those best endeavors. We didn't expect, and frankly, nor should we have been expected to expect, that the European Union would have conducted itself so egregiously badly. So if you're in a negotiation and your counterparty behaves extremely badly and refuses to observe the terms of the agreement under which the negotiation is set up, surely you too have certain rights. And we have the right to put our own national interest first. And our national interest, in this case, is nothing less than the continued integrity of the United Kingdom. Consider, for example, what the Northern Ireland Protocol says. It says that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom's customs territory, whereas in fact, the provisions of the agreement make it clear that it's part of the EU's. There's a significant danger, therefore, that unless the EU negotiates with us in good faith, the provisions of the protocol will become permanent, and that Northern Ireland will be subject to the EU customs code, and tariffs will be imposed upon goods passing from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Now, in other words, the integrity of the UK internal market will be ruptured, contrary to the provisions of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. But if this does, on the face of it, look bad, it's certainly the case that there is a way out of it. And the way out of it, as Barney has made clear, is quite simply to enter into the sort of free trade agreement that was contemplated in the wording of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. A properly constructed free trade agreement will subsume and obliterate the difficulties that we have identified in the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And there is every incentive for both parties, including the EU, to proceed along that line. The EU has a great deal to lose if these negotiations come to naught. At the moment, it has a surplus of some £90 billion per annum in terms of manufactured goods coming from the EU to the UK. That advantage would disappear if we were to leave and trade with them on World Trade Organization terms.
Okay, this is now an opportunity for our audience to send in questions. Now, the first one I've got about the timescales involved on these negotiations. David, you mentioned the 15th of October, and I just wonder what is the view of our two speakers as to whether the 15th of October is a date that will be overshot, and we will in fact be going up to midnight on the 31st of December, trying to sort out these key issues.
Would you like me to go first?
Yeah, absolutely, David.
Well, you're right, Barry. That's traditionally the way that the EU does business. And I remember that from the time that I was a minister at DEXU and sitting in a conference chamber in Luxembourg, waiting for approval of the CETA, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and drinking several cups of coffee and then actually leaving because the Wallonian government refused to approve it. So certainly last-minute negotiations are very much part of the EU's modus operandi. I don't think it's going to happen in this case, though, because I think that a clear warning has been given. I think that there is every prospect of negotiating an agreement because I understand, I'm told from various sources, that the negotiations have actually pepped up considerably since the deadline was imposed. And I think that that's an indication of the fact that the EU were as anxious as us, possibly more anxious, to conclude a free trade agreement. So I think there is every hope of doing that. But there's certainly a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Barney, any comment on that?
Yes, I mean, I could see there being a deadline missed by the EU and the UK, making clearer that there's no cherry picking and the withdrawal agreement falls away if the EU doesn't deliver on its promise. But in a way that won't change anything because the EU will then still have till the year end to agree such an arrangement. And if they want the UK to agree specifics on Northern Ireland, money and so on in that ultimate arrangement, they've still got time to do so. So I could see it sort of putting a bit of pressure and turning up the heat. I think as a governance matter, the EU they find it structurally difficult to agree to major points, except at the 11th hour with all the key people in a room. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of the major things get agreed by them at the end. But as I say, so long as the UK doesn't allow the EU to cherry pick and leave any bits of the withdrawal agreement arrangements and Northern Ireland Protocol in place, if there isn't this satisfactory end agreement, I'm not sure it matters.
Thank you very much, Barney. Now, I'm very pleased to say that Sammy Wilson has joined us. Sammy, as many of you know, is the DUP Member of Parliament for East Hampton. Before entering Parliament, he served as Lord Mayor of Belfast and as a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly and a member of the Northern Ireland Executive. At Westminster, Sammy is the DUP spokesman on Brexit. Nearly 4 years ago, he asked the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland the following question: will the Secretary of State assure us that there will be no special status, no separate arrangements or different conditions, which would mean that Northern Ireland's position as part of the United Kingdom would be changed? Sammy did not receive a satisfactory reply, and no satisfactory answer has been forthcoming in the years that have followed. Welcome, Sammy, and we would now all look forward to hearing what you have to say regarding the current situation. Sammy Wilson.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think actually subsequent events have given us the answer to the question which I asked 4 years ago, and that is that Northern Ireland is being treated separately. Northern Ireland is actually being used as the foot in the door for the EU, even after we have left the European Union, and Brexit has been, to use the Prime Minister's words, done. And I think that I would have a rather pessimistic view of the negotiations at present. But first of all, what's good about the current situation? And I suppose there's a number of things. First of all, the government has made it quite clear they're not going to allow this endless extension of the deadline to go on, a chance for the EU to try and wear us down further or hope for a change in political circumstances. Secondly, we're already in the process of achieving the trade deals that were promised once we left the EU with other countries. And I think it does indicate that there is a willingness from countries across the world to recognise that, first of all, we are a major producer. We are a major player in world markets, and they want to have a share of our market and are prepared to give us shares of their markets, and that's good for jobs across the United Kingdom. Thirdly, the government's in a much better negotiating position now because, of course, they can't be undermined by a wafer-thin majority in Parliament and a large section of their own party prepared to act as agents for the EU, which, of course, was what happened before the election when the Conservative Party got a bigger majority. And thirdly, we have seen some resolve on some resolve on the part of the government with the Internal Markets Bill and a willingness to take on the European Union when they feel that they have not been playing the proper part in negotiations. Those are the positives I see at the moment. The negatives I see at the moment is that all of the negotiations at present are being done against the background of the withdrawal agreement. And many people have focused on the Northern Ireland part of the withdrawal agreement, and I'll mention something of that in a moment, but it should be remembered that the withdrawal agreement itself has still huge implications for the ability of the European Union to have a say and to make decisions about, and indeed to be the ultimate arbiter of things in the United Kingdom after we leave. I mean, for example, when it comes to how much will we actually have to pay. The European Court of Justice will be the final arbiter as to whether or not we're meeting all of our financial obligations. When it comes to citizens' rights, if there's a challenge to how we have applied the legislation, the regulations and rules about EU citizens who remain in the United Kingdom, they will be able to appeal to the European Court of Justice as a result of the withdrawal agreement. Disputes which are referred to Europe over the next 4 years will still be subject where those disputes impact on EU legislation and EU regulations will be decided by the European Court of Justice. And of course, any disputes about Northern Ireland through the Joint Committee will ultimately end up in the European Court of Justice. If the government does not see through the terms of the Internal Markets Bill which I have some difficulties with, then EU state aid rules as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol will still apply to the whole of the United Kingdom. And that's one of the reasons why, of course, the government has been prepared to take the unusual step of going against the law, and caused all the kinds of problems which there have been. So, I mean, against the background of the withdrawal agreement, I think that we have got to bear in mind that there are still huge difficulties. It also worries me when I see the way the government has rolled over to some of the dissent which emerged within its own ranks, especially around changing parts of the withdrawal agreement just this week. I mean, within a day of some of those who are still Remainers within the Conservative Party raising their objections and ramping up their objections, the government was prepared to change the terms of the bill. And now, of course, while it wasn't going to come in operation until the ministers decided. Now, of course, there's the other safeguards that they will see through the EU resolution requirements before they put any legislation to Parliament. And of course, the EU has still proven to be intransigent, though I think it is significant, and David has made the point, they haven't walked away from the negotiations, even though they said that they would. As far as the Northern Ireland Protocol is concerned, the government does have, in my view, an obligation to ensure that we do remain part of the European, the UK customs territory, that the internal market of the UK is not disrupted, and both of those things are contradicted by the Northern Ireland Protocol. And since they have raised time and time again this week the need to defend the Belfast Agreement, then they have to live up to the terms of the Belfast Agreement. And don't forget, the Belfast Agreement was set to address the fears of both nationalists who wanted to have some ability to have connections with the Republic and the opportunity to join the Irish Republic ultimately if the people of Northern Ireland decided so. But there was also an obligation to Unionists that Northern Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom until or unless the people of Northern Ireland decided otherwise, and also that there would be a mechanism within the agreement to ensure that where there were controversial issues, that they had to be done in a cross-community vote. Now, the consent mechanism was taken away with the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom definitely has changed. David actually asked a very good question in the House of Commons a couple of weeks ago, where he referred to the Act of Union itself and pointed out that the Act of Union is as much about economics as it is about constitutional issues, and states quite clearly that there will not be any tariffs or restrictions on trade within or between the nations of the United Kingdom. Well, of course, the withdrawal agreement makes sure that Northern Ireland will face tariffs and will have interruptions of its trade with other parts of the United Kingdom. So the agreement itself has removed the principle of consent and has also moved some of the safeguards on those sensitive issues. And that's why my view is that if in these negotiations, the government does not replace the withdrawal agreement, then there are dangers that the UK as a whole will not be properly realising its freedom from the European Union, and Northern Ireland definitely will not be left as part of the United Kingdom, but rather will be left as an annex to the EU. Just on I'll finish with this. Just on the Internal Markets Bill, whilst the government has taken the power to remove the requirement to abide by European Union state aid rules for Great Britain, those will still apply in Northern Ireland. And that presents two problems. The first problem is that Northern Ireland will be unable to benefit from the support which the UK government would give and which is outlined in the Internal Markets Bill for emerging industries, for infrastructure, etc. And secondly, we will not have any defence mechanism against predatory behaviour by the Irish Republic, which is they don't collaborate with us when it comes to economic matters. They compete with us. And indeed, we have seen many of our industries where, when we have been chasing investment and the Irish government's been chasing investment, they have been prepared to use all kinds of methods to try and make sure, quite rightly, the investment goes to their country rather than to Northern Ireland. We will not have any defence against that, because we don't have any place in the European Commission where someone can raise it on our behalf. And we have no judges in the European Court of Justice where ultimately any dispute would be decided. And secondly, of course, if we can't benefit from the support which the government would give to businesses and industries and regions in other parts of the United Kingdom, the real danger is that firms in Northern Ireland will say, well, we can actually get these benefits by relocating in Great Britain. And that's what they'll do. So there are many issues to be fixed. And I don't believe they can be fixed by the kind of tinkering which there is in the Internal Markets Bill. They can only be fixed if there's a fundamental replacement of the withdrawal agreement. And I think, and this is a message which I think is very important for those who want to see Brexit delivered for the whole of the United Kingdom. Look closely at the other terms of the withdrawal agreement and realise just how much input the European Union will still have in the life and in decisions for the United Kingdom as a whole. That's the reason why in these negotiations we have to aim for a free trade agreement, and I believe, and Barney has outlined why it should be possible to achieve that, but that free trade arrangement must also be accompanied by a replacement of the withdrawal agreement.
Thank you very much indeed, Sammy. Well, I just wonder if we could just take forward that point of Sammy's. Regarding David and Barney, do you agree that the withdrawal agreement needs to be replaced? Barney?
Yeah, well, certainly I do. As I said in my talk, I think that what is essential is that we get rid of the withdrawal agreement completely. And the way to do it is to have a free trade agreement that basically subsumes all the provisions of the withdrawal agreement into the new FTA. And in fact, we actually thought we were negotiating something like that. So, you know, I think we've every right to demand that that is what we get. And of course, if we don't get it, then of course the government has got to consider what other options it has.
Do you think it's, you agree, do you think it is the government's intention to get a new withdrawal agreement?
I hope so. I think I want one key point. I mean, obviously, winding the clock back, we said at the time it was impossible to separate out the Northern Ireland border from future trade arrangements. So we were right. It was right then, it's right now. And so the issue needs to be collapsed back into the arrangements at the end of the year and dealt with properly there. And as I say, there can't be cherry picking. The EU can't say, well, we managed to sort of get a position where we get an advantage on that and we pocket that regardless. I mean, that's not the nature of what's been agreed to. The reason that the effects that Sammy outlined in relation to the Northern Ireland border are adverse to the UK interests and against what is in Article 4 of the political declaration as to what the parties have agreed to get at year end, is that the border is in the wrong place. It's been moved to the Irish Sea. And you've got EU law applicable in Northern Ireland, including EU state aid law. And so winding the clock forward in 5-10 years, if one goes away across from Great Britain, you'll see different specifications for, you know, washing machines, tumble dryers, and for cars and so on. And it'll feel somewhat foreign in a way to people going across from Great Britain, which is not the point at all, and that's not what has been agreed. And in particular, we can't protect the Northern Irish not just from state aid in the south, but also from the distortions created by the Eurozone, which are not dealt with and ignored by EU state aid law. So the EU, so in the north, we'd be required to do nothing about that, whereas we could protect GP. So it clearly doesn't work. The only way to make it work, and the UK has put forward one aspect of this already very clearly, is by having an invisible north-south border on the island of Ireland. And there are two ways to do that. The first of which the UK has pushed hard, which is alternative arrangements, all sorts of use of the latest technologies to make that invisible. And that works. The EU look at all the different, it involves sort of 20, 30 different ways of achieving it. And the EU points to theoretical holes between each method. And so it hasn't agreed it so far. The other way to do it is to take that off the table, and for the UK effectively to guarantee that the border is invisible using a technique known as mutual enforcement, which we've not pushed so far. And I think we should just offer to the EU, whereby the UK agrees, basically enforces EU customs and other laws against producers sending things across the border into the Republic and vice versa. And that conceptually is pure. No one can say it doesn't work because it's effectively a guarantee. And if the EU were to find things coming into the Republic in breach, they'd get damages and vice versa. And the mutuality means that it's honest, so that no one gets sort of one up by the way it's drafted. But it's unanswerable. And that's where we should end up, and we should have got in the beginning. But I don't think the EU's been willing to discuss those points so far. So we've had this hybrid process with everything coming to the end of the year. And it does have to be replaced for all the reasons Sammy says. And David.
Thank you. Any further comment at all, David?
No, I think that, that there are other options available. And the fact is that we have to make it clear to the European Union that if there is to be a hard customs border on the island of Ireland, we will not be putting it up. They will have to make the decision whether they're going to put it up. And I would imagine the answer would probably be no.
Thank you very much. I've got another question here about the government's communications. We're actually getting quite a lot of clarity on the issues at this meeting this afternoon. But this question asks, how should the government set about getting its message across to the British people, as the British people currently seem to be faced with nothing but confusion?
Would you like me to go again first?
Yeah, absolutely.
I can understand why that question is being asked. I have to say that I think that government communications until fairly recently have been very poor. Certainly in the early stages during the Theresa May prime ministership, I think that it would have been far more sensible if the government had made very clear, very open and public preparations to leave the European Union without a withdrawal agreement if necessary. For example, going to the extent of doing what the government is doing now, and that is building extra facilities for lorries, huge customs sheds in Dover and so on. The communications are there, but you actually have to seek it. You have to go online, you have to go onto what is quite a difficult to navigate website of the government's, but the information is there. But you're absolutely right. People want to know whether, for the sake of argument, on the 1st of January, if we don't have a withdrawal agreement, whether they can safely go out and order a new car. At the moment, they don't know things like that. And it's something that I think the government should be doing to ramp up the volume at the moment. And I think everybody would welcome that.
Thank you very much. Barney?
Can I just make one point?
Yeah, do come in.
On government communications. And I think that one of the problems with government communications at present is that much of the communication on the ground is still being done by departments, where those who are in the departments either are not really committed to leaving the EU, and therefore the message which they give will not be as clear as any political message which the government would wish to give. Or secondly, where they have taken the view that in the absence of any clarity in the negotiations, you prepare as if the full EU terms of or EU understanding of the withdrawal agreement will be applied. And I can tell you this from Northern Ireland. I still have firms here in Northern Ireland who tell me that HMRC officials are going around telling them that, look, you're going to have to fill in export declarations. This is what it's likely to cost. And some firms have estimated it's going to cost them £1 million extra additional. Just down the road from me, a planning application has gone in this morning at the behest of officials within the departments for a border control post, which is assuming that all of the requirements which the EU are going to make for the stopping of vehicles, the searching of lorries, even where those lorries are taking goods, for example, to the Asda store down the road and are going to be consumed in the town of Larne, not in Dublin. But the assumption is that the EU says that lorry will have to be searched, so therefore we build a control post which facilitates that level of intrusion and that level of checks. Now, I think that the government itself has perhaps been negligent insofar as not having a clear view of the final outcome of the negotiations, has simply allowed departments to prepare for the worst. And the worst, of course, is what the EU would require of Britain rather than what Britain is prepared to accept by way of EU intrusion.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Barney, have you got any thoughts on this issue?
Not really. I just suppose just one point maybe worth making, which is that I think it's very difficult to sort of litigate in a way all of these points in the court of public opinion real time, given how fast moving things are. So as one point of sympathy for why we're where we are, I can see some merit in just doing things and proceeding and avoiding too much debate over reasoning in public, although that does need to happen in Parliament. But yeah, it's a very tricky situation. It's sort of relationship brain surgery in a way, in terms of reconstructing a relationship with the EU against a very difficult backdrop, because we're dealing with quite a tricky set of behaviours. And there's the rest of the world looking on as well, and things shifting around there as well at the same time. So it's certainly very tricky.
Thank you very much. Now I've got another question coming here. The question is, do you think the EU are bluffing and they'll eventually agree to a free trade agreement? Now, that's a question for all of our panelists. David Jones, what's your response to that?
It's always hard to say if someone's bluffing, but what I would say is that they have slightly given their hand away over the last few weeks. And I think that they did this most noticeably when they refused to walk away from the negotiating table, as you would have expected when they heard about the UK Internal Market Bill and its clauses. But they said, no, we demand that you withdraw the bill by the end of the month, and in the meantime we'll carry on talking to you. So that makes me think that they actually do want an agreement. They would be really mad if they didn't want one. It would be so punitive to their manufacturing industry if exports to the UK were subject to tariffs. So I think that they probably do want one. Whether we're bluffing or not remains to be seen. I actually believe that Boris would actually walk away from the table on the 15th of October, which would probably be a very good thing indeed. And of course, we have less to lose than the European Union. They've got this big surplus in terms of good trade in manufactured goods. They've also got the need to access our capital markets, as Barney pointed out. And it's interesting to note that only this week, they announced that EU banks can continue to have access to London clearinghouses until 2022, which tends to underline how dependent they are upon the City of London for capital. So I think there is a lot of bluff going on, but of course I'm not a betting man, so I wouldn't like to say that for certain.
Okay, Sammy, what does your Ulsterman's common sense tell you on this one?
I suppose it's my experience that worries that would cause me to have some worry on this, and I think that David made the point which David made is the important one. Are the EU bluffing, or is our own government bluffing? I can see some parallels, not exactly the same as last year, but some parallels between this year and last autumn as well, when the government talked tough in coming up to the negotiations. We will not accept the May deal. We want to get Brexit done. We're going to get out. We're going to get out by a certain date. And it doesn't matter whether you give us a deal or whether you don't. We're leaving, etc. And at the end of the day, of course, the government accepted basically the Theresa May deal. If that was the experience last year, I know it was done against a different background where they didn't have a majority in Parliament, where the party was falling apart, and where there was a danger that if there was an election, Jeremy Corbyn could have got in. The government's faced a different position now. Of course, they've got an 80-seat majority, etc. But they have other problems with all of the coronavirus and the impact it has had on the economy and the disquiet there is about the impact it's just having on the economy. My fear is that we will get the same situation developing this autumn as we had last autumn, whereby there'll be tough talking, there'll be threats made, and then at the end of the day, we will get a deal which the government will hope to spin as being a bad deal and as a good deal. And, you know, I do have some concerns, especially when I hear people who are genuine friends of Northern Ireland in the House of Commons. And when you spell out what the implications of the withdrawal agreement are, they say, we didn't realise that. And, you know, I think with all of these deals, they at the end do become complicated. A lot of people do make a decision on the spin which there is on whether they trust the person who is selling the deal rather than know the exact details of the deal itself and examine the details of the deal. And I would hope the government wouldn't try the same approach this year as what happened last year. Talk tough, give in, then try and spin it and successfully fool people that it has been a deal which is not as good as what it was claimed to be.
Thank you, Sammy. Barney, have you got any comment on this point?
Well, I suppose, I mean, at the moment, I mean, all the evidence is that the government means it. And I think the situation is just different with the majority and the people we now have. And I think we've got a good negotiating team. So I think the omens are good. And the decision was made in January, you know, having got a majority on the basis there wouldn't be a hard Brexit at the end of January, to sign the withdrawal agreement and give ourselves 11 more months to get a sovereignty compliant future relationship at year end. And I think it looks like the government is actioning exactly that. I mean, I would say it's exceedingly difficult for one key reason, which is the EU, as part of the logic that people have pumped themselves up on, one strand is particularly difficult, which is the idea that you've got to be worse off out than in. And of course, it's an absurd idea because there should be a benefit to being in the EU other than trade. And it's rather revealing and a sorry state of affairs that it appears to be thought that there isn't. But nevertheless, that concept the UK can't deliver on. And so, you know, that's the trickiest thing. We've got to wait and see whether EU is okay getting over that point. And I think as time, in fact, the additional 11 months have helped. I think, awful as it is, the intervention of COVID and the stresses that's put everyone's systems under and the human cost to that, I think brings a dose of reality to some of these evaluations. Because in the pure abstract, when everything's going swimmingly, one could maybe maintain that sort of ideology. But I think right now, I would anticipate that being ditched. And I think that we're set up, I think we are set up for success in a way. And I think it is possible to get a win-win outcome at year end. And I just, you know, so long as people just stick to the logic.
Thank you very much for that, Barney. Now, the next question I've got is about fishing. I wonder if our panel could give us some indication as to what they think the eventual outcome on fisheries will be. Can we start off with David Jones on this one?
I think that the government has got to stick to its guns on fisheries. Fisheries is totemic. If you liked, it was emblematic of the deceit of our entry into the European Union, or as it was then, the European Economic Community back in 1973. It was given away. Our fishermen were betrayed. And I think that any British government that did not reverse that betrayal would probably be in for huge difficulties, not only among the rather small fishing communities around the country, but really the wider UK, who also understand the totemic significance of fisheries. I think ultimately what will happen will be that we will enter into an arrangement whereby they recognize ultimately that we are an independent coastal state. They drop the ridiculous suggestion that the fish swimming in British waters are EU fish. They recognize that they have to negotiate with us on an annual basis for access to our waters, just as they do with Norway. And it may be that there will be a phasing in process, but I don't believe that that period should be too long.
Thank you. Sammy, could we have a Northern Ireland perspective on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, fishing again is, while it's not a important industry in terms of the total number of people employed, it is important in particular sectors and particular areas in Northern Ireland. And it is, as David has said, it is the industry where people look to see just, first of all, how in negotiations the government did in 1973 betray thriving communities, and those communities have been devastated. That it highlights the inefficiency of EU centralised policies as well. You know, where we find that we talk about sustainability, and yet large trawlers from outside the UK are devastating some of our fishing grounds, and because of EU policies, where fishermen were forced to throw into the ocean billions of fish because of the quota system, etc. So I mean, it highlights just how when with some European interference, it can be wasteful, it can be devastating of communities, etc. And since it has become such an important issue during the whole Brexit debate, I think the government will find it difficult to walk away from. And don't forget, of course, where politically the government is trying to hold its own or to gain additional seats in Scotland. I think if Scottish, and I attended some rallies in Scotland during the Brexit debate, and one of the things which I think got people to rally around the Conservative Party in Scotland was the fact that the Conservative Party was prepared to stand up for fishing communities. And I think that many people who have voted for the Conservative in Scotland would find it a gross betrayal if those promises, and I heard Michael Gove himself at some of those rallies make promises to people and cheered to the rafters for it. So there's a political imperative, I think, on the government to do this. At the end of the day, you know, the important thing is having control, first of all, of our waters, having control of the policies which are adhered to in those waters. And then if the government then decides, but look, we don't have the capacity to catch all the fish in those waters, we're prepared to do deals with the European Union to allow European Union fishing boats in on certain terms, then I think that people will live with that. But what they will not live with is the EU demand that somehow or other they want and they demand that we continue on with the practices which there are at present, namely that the policies for our waters are decided in Brussels, and the people who benefit from those policies are communities and fishermen outside the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Sammy. Barney, what are your thoughts on the fishing issues?
Well, legally, I think there's only one sort of arrangement that we can come to, which is what David described. I mean, it's essentially underwater territory belonging to the UK, and I don't think any future arrangement in the context of Brexit could be acceptable if it involves giving up effectively sovereignty, which is effectively control or power over a UK asset. And so there obviously needs to be a taper down for EU access and annual negotiations and discussions on that. But ultimately, they're UK waters, and the UK calls the shots, and obviously they'll be managed in the interests of the UK, and there will be some sort of access arrangement that no doubt will prove satisfactory over time, that is consistent with that.
Thank you. Now, I've got a question from Jeff here. Jeff says, if we listed all the real stroke perceived infractions of good faith, whose list would be the longest, the EU's or the UK's? Sammy Wilson, do you have any thoughts on that one? Hello, Sammy. Okay, Sammy doesn't seem to be with us at the moment. Can I switch to David?
Well, I haven't done a tally, but I have to say that the EU seemed to be pretty blatantly in breach of a lot of obligations under the withdrawal agreement, to the extent that I think that the United Kingdom has got an absolute right to reply, and the reply has got to be in terms of safeguarding UK sovereignty, which is ultimately what the whole object of the exercise is. I'm not entirely sure that we have breached very much. We have actually indicated that we might breach it, but being British and being sporting about it, we flagged it up beforehand. But certainly the EU are in breach now.
Thank you. Barney, any comment on this point?
Well, the one I'm aware of that the EU would allege against the UK, because I don't think in good conscience they could allege anything on fishing, which wasn't considered in the political declaration in the form that they're saying. But I in the past, they framed things as requiring, under the terms of the political declaration, the UK to agree EU law on state aid and so-called level playing field measures, competition and so on, environment. The UK is, I mean, as I understand what we've been saying, in private as well as in public, just from reading reports, is saying that fine to discuss the topic, but we're not agreeing to that being done through EU law, which seems to me to be self-evidently correct because of Article 4 of the Political Declaration, which I mentioned, which provides for future UK sovereignty consistent with, of course, Brexit as a whole. So I'm not aware of any such breach, obvious breach by the UK. I mean, in fact, I'd add on the level playing field concept, as I've explained, the playing field is actually unlevel in a very, very dramatic way because of the Eurozone, which has not yet been discussed, so far as I'm aware. And until that's dealt with, I mean, you're talking about very minor things indeed if you're trying to put in place arrangements to protect the EU against UK subsidisation. The UK, of course, historically being a low subsidiser compared with those on the continent, some on the continent. So, but I mean, ultimately, I don't think it's a question of keeping a tally, were there to be such breaches by the UK and sort of setting them off against breaches by the EU. I think you need to look at the entire purpose of the arrangements that we entered into and what the UK Parliament thought it was agreeing to when it voted them through, which is that you end up collapsing back these issues, which, like Northern Ireland, the UK made quite clear all the way through the negotiations under Theresa May's administration, you know, couldn't be separated from trade, had to be collapsed back into a future trade arrangement. And if, and the frame, and Article 50 says you have to agree your withdrawal on the basis of the framework for the future relationship. Well, that framework is the political declaration. If that framework turns out to be illusory because it's not capable of being delivered and the EU aren't on for delivering it, then the entire arrangement falls away. I think that's the operative point. And as I say, keeping tally of, oh, well, you know, this on this occasion, someone raised this point, it was a breach, I think misses the wood from the trees, which is that you've got to look at the fact that this is an exit negotiation to complete, sort of tie things up, tie up loose ends and come to a new arrangement. And if that doesn't happen, then you can't have cherry picking along the way by the EU, and you can't have bits of the process sort of remaining in perpetuity that happen to be favourable to the EU. That's not the point at all. It doesn't work legally.
Thank you. Now, Barney, you said the Eurozone had not been decided yet. What outcome would you like to see regarding the Eurozone?
I think what I think I said was that the Eurozone, the impact of the Eurozone's legal setup doesn't appear to have been discussed yet, but I don't know, obviously. But it doesn't seem to have been publicly discussed yet. And that involves trade dumping on the UK and the US, by the way, unfair subsidization of exports to the detriment of the UK and the US and others, by the way, and the dumping of financial risk on the global markets, the UK and US being the hosts of the global markets, principal hosts of the global markets, to the detriment of savers and investors around the world, because everyone's assets are exposed to the Eurozone system when they shouldn't be, because the system should be constructed in a way that's safe, and it isn't. And I think, therefore, the dumping and subsidization can only be dealt with sensibly, it seems to me, through self-help remedies of duties and tariffs. And under an FTA, there could be some process of rationalization put around that to make sure it's fair, and takes into account all the evidence from the EU, which I would have thought the UK would be prepared to do. On the dumping of financial risk, that's a very, very serious issue for the world to grapple with, and that just can't be left ignored. And the only way of continuing things continuing the UK's role as the co-host of the global market in mitigating that risk for the world's investors and savers is for there to be an enhanced equivalence deal for financial services, which essentially continues the current practice where UK-based financial services firms service EU customers cross-border from the UK only, without being subject to EU sort of local rules. They're only subject to one set of rules and then supervised in the UK. Now, after Brexit, it'll be slightly different to now. So at the moment, the rules are all made at a pan-European level with UK inputs. That won't be the case afterwards. Instead, on the enhanced equivalence concept, which builds basically, makes some minor adjustments to and builds out from an existing EU law equivalence regime, the UK financial services firms would sell their services and products across Europe under solely UK law and regulation as determined from time to time solely in the autonomous discretion of the UK, obviously complying with international Basel and other rules, and under UK supervision. And so that would continue the status quo for the EU and the Eurozone of the UK applying a protective blanket, as it were, which undoes or protects the world's savers and investors, including UK taxpayers, from Eurozone risk, which is very considerable and runs in the trillions.
Thank you very much indeed, Barney. Now, I understand the BBC are listening to this, and if they'd like to unmute their microphone, we'd be happy to receive a question from the BBC reporters. The next question I've got from the rest of our audience is regarding the European Investment Bank. Is there any prospect of us being able to free ourselves from the ongoing obligations, financial obligations, which run into billions and billions of pounds that we seem to have given in respect of the European Investment Bank? David, have you got any opinion on that?
Well, yes. I mean, this has been an issue that's been raised recently by those who would suggest that we run the risk of bankruptcy because of our guarantees for the European Investment Bank. Barney will have far more technical knowledge of this than I do, but as I understand it, our guarantees are guarantees that are shared with all other member states. So essentially, you'd have to have a catastrophic failure right across the whole of the European economy for the guarantees to be called in. I think I'm right in saying that the European Investment Bank has got 600 billion euros of reserves of its own, which it would have to exhaust first before it then looked to other member states. You'd also have to see every single company that was the beneficiary of support by the EIB failing. And it seems to me that that would be such an enormous, immense catastrophe that it would probably affect the very existence of the European Union itself. I think the reality is that there have been very few, if any, defaults, and those that have been threatened have been usually smoothed out by extending the time for repayment. So I'm personally not losing any sleep over our guarantees to the EIB.
Thank you, David. Barney, any comments at all on the ongoing obligations vis-a-vis the European Investment Bank?
Yes, I do think we should clean this up as part of the end of year arrangements. There are vast sort of balance sheet liabilities that the UK is exposed to in relation to a project which is internal to the EU, and the UK is therefore no longer a part of. I think the cleanest way to do it would be, and it's against the backdrop of a very risky Eurozone system, which as I've explained, offloads at the moment the risk of itself onto the global markets at the considerable cost of businesses operating here, and also investors and savers, and remains pretty it remains pretty fragile. And so there is a risk of a country within the Eurozone defaulting over the next years on its obligations, which then gets spread across everyone else. And I think given the UK is no longer party to this and not seeking to be participating in investment in the future, growth of the EU, which is an internal matter and with an internal benefit to the EU, the UK assets of the EIB, the cleanest thing would just be to take the UK assets out of the EIB and put them in the UK Investment Bank and switch over the liabilities as well for the UK bits, and leave the EIB to carry on, but in relation to ongoing EU business assets and investments. And that then gets rid of any arguments over who's responsible for what, and it gives it ensures that the UK taxpayer is not exposed. And you can debate how much likely it is ever to arise, but it's not exposed for risks of someone else's system.
If I could just clarify,
Yeah,
I agree with
there.
Barney that we should clear it up. But if for whatever reason we find it impossible to do so, I don't think we should lose too much sleep over it. But there we are.
Okay, thank you on that one, David, and Barney. Thank you for a very clear statement vis-a-vis the European Investment Bank. We greatly appreciate that. Now, we've had the pleasure of listening to our speakers now for nearly 90 minutes, and I know that they have got very heavy commitments elsewhere. Sammy's already gone to do a BBC interview, but I would like to thank Barney and David, particularly when they have so many demands on their time and expertise, to have given us this hour and a half this afternoon, and to enable all of us to avail ourselves of the tremendous expertise and closeness to these issues that they have, and to add clarity to what has been, I think, for many of our members, a very unclear picture of where we stand. Gentlemen, I thank both of you deeply for coming today, and your contribution has been very, very welcome to our debate. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.